Welcome back to Wartime Cafe. We are in Myzian Coffee Shop Restaurant on Hamra Street, and we have with us a first-time guest from Australia, Professor Tim Anderson. Tim, thank you for coming to sit down with us to tell us about your stories and the analysis of what's happening right now in the war. Before we continue with this episode, I ask everybody to press the subscribe button on whatever social media platform you're watching this on, and to go to our website, freepalestine.video, to donate so we can continue bringing you this content. Tim, a lot of people know you online from your commentary on social media, from your lectures around the world, but since it's your first time here, we'd like to give the audience the chance to know what is behind Tim Anderson and how he got here. My understanding is you started your academic career working and studying on political economy, and that's where your PhD in the 1980s was developed. And you were concentrated at the time on the Latin America and also obviously the Neo-Liberalism that was coming at the end of the Soviet Union era in Australia. Take us through this. Why did you decide to study this subject, and how can you connect those two issues, Neo-Liberalism in Australia and the struggle for decolonization in Latin America?
Well, thank you for inviting me, Laith. So my way of thinking had a number of influences. I've been an internationalist for a long time, but I did do my PhD in neoliberalism, and really putting those two together, I began to form this idea. I published on this of hegemonic neoliberalism. That neoliberalism is not an abstract set of policies or a theory. It is an outgrowth of the Anglo-American hegemonic project for several centuries. So in other words, the question of imperial domination is inevitably linked into economic policy, basically. So when people say Syria or some other country is neoliberal, I say, no, you don't really understand neoliberalism. I think we have to understand domination in the world, imperialism, alongside it and conjoined with the imperial plans, and also how that transmits into economic policy. And it means submission. It means double standards in language, and it means submission to the hegemonic project of the Anglo-Americans. So from there, I went back to internationalism after that project, which, as you say, was focused on Australia. And I spent a fair bit of time in Latin America. My second language is Spanish, so I was defending Cuba and Venezuela at a time before the dirty war on Syria began. And the fact that they were the same clowns singing the same songs over Syria as were doing over Cuba and Venezuela attracted my attention. And I was very upset too, as a child who'd grown up during the Vietnam War, at being lied about the latest war that our country was involved in, because all of the Western countries, through their subservience to Washington, have been involved in all of these wars, from Afghanistan to Lebanon, invasion of Israel and Iraq and Syria and Libya and so on. So that gave me a little bit of venom you need a little bit of venom to drive you along, to motivate you, to say there's something wrong here and there's a gap here, and I want to, as an educator as a writer, as an educator, I wanted to share with other people my thoughts about what was going on. So then the first book that I wrote on this region, on the West Asia region, the dirty war on Syria.
Before you jump into the dirty war on Syria, I want to take a step back for a second here. A lot of people don't understand how important the role of Australia is in delivering on the imperialist plans of the United States, where the seat of power of the empire is, and for instance, the fact that Australia was involved heavily in the Vietnam War. Most people just remember things from the movies and only see Americans in those movies. So how does Australia specifically play a role in this hierarchy within the imperial order, policing the region around it, and how does the colonial history of Australia as, in extracting resources while killing indigenous people. How does this relate to Australia's involvement, let's say, in Latin America, where you eventually concentrated your...
Well, it's a parallel history to that of Canada, I guess, which you understand. That, of course, there is this settler colonial background, which makes them instinctively, the elite, instinctively collaborators with the imperial project. And it's not that Australia is that important, but it's part of this Anglosphere where they provide a voice and some limited collaboration militarily to the latest war coming from Washington, basically, and then add to the pretense that there is this coalition or international community, as they say, when really it's the ambitions, the hegemonic ambitions of the US that are driving it, basically, and then contributing from time to time to finance the arms industry and so on, as with the recent supposed purchase of nuclear-powered submarines, which is the latest disaster, and huge contradictions, of course, in a little peripheral country like Australia, where really our biggest trade partner is China, and that's being damaged very seriously by the military collaboration with the US in the South China Sea. So there are all these sorts of contradictions, but really Australia is not that important, but it plays this toxic role in supporting the US, as you say, with the Vietnam War, but also, the fact that they were involved, the Australian troops were involved in serious war crimes in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and also in Syria, and they are suppressed to a large extent.
Yes, so definitely the Australians were involved in Syria, just like they were involved in Vietnam. And again, people sometimes overlook that involvement. And so you were in Latin America covering those attacks on progressive movements in Venezuela and Cuba, and then you decided, as you were seeing Syria become the next victim, to go ahead and visit the country and start studying the involvement. You have, by the way, for all our audience, Tim has 7 books out there. You're a prolific writer, and many of those books cover all these issues that we're talking about. And your latest book is West Asia After Washington, that came out in 2023, just before the beginning of the genocide in Gaza. And the Arabic version came in 2024. So go back to your question, the question that I was asking you. How did you make this jump? And once you went to Syria, what did you see?
So first of all, I think because I and my friends were also involved in the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement was quite large in relation to Iraq, which was a very overt, direct, crude intervention, of course, and there were large demonstrations which didn't have much impact in the end on the government practice there. But with Syria, of course, this was the shift to the so-called smart power of the liberal faction in the US, where these color revolutions or hybrid wars began to be carried out. And the anti-war movement in Australia collapsed. I think the anti-war movement in much of the West collapsed with the attacks on Libya and Syria.
Yeah, the Arab Autumn, I would call it, not the Arab Spring, was designed specifically to fool, number one, the Arabic people into these colored revolutions, and to distract and fragment the anti-war movement in the West that were all gathered around Palestine before that moment, and then were fractured into those smaller issues and contradicting positionalities that fractured them.
Using, the arguments of human rights and, that there was some sort of democratic move to the latest war, the latest hybrid war, and because it wasn't an invasion in the way that Iraq and Afghanistan were, or even the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which nevertheless all of the elites in the West supported, as they are now, still, so the anti-war movement really collapsed. It was an enormous success to the Obama-Clinton line of politics in the US. We have to admit that their skill in propaganda, in media, in ideology was very powerful. It's one of the things that still, I think, distinguishes US imperialism, that they have control of this doublespeak in a way that the Europeans never had, because the Europeans always had empires, and the US always denied that it was part of an empire or had colonies.
So I would say like Al Jazeera is currently, as it was at the beginning of the Arab Autumn, the most valuable propaganda machine that especially right now with the fall of all the credibility of Western mass media, Al Jazeera right now is the #1 propaganda tool, most valuable one that the West controls.
Yes, it was very important in the colour revolutions in Libya and Syria. Syrian people themselves were watching it at the time, and then they walked out the door and saw something that was different to what was on Al Jazeera. So it took them a little while to wake up to that, but really it was an Arab Muslim Brotherhood version of the BBC, basically, and remains that way, and with a semblance of credibility, because in some respects their reporting on Gaza was relatively good because of the history with Muslim Brotherhood groups in Gaza, most prominently Hamas in its Muslim Brotherhood stage. I would say Hamas has changed its character in recent years, but nevertheless they were very important in ideological wars, because they had seemed to have some credibility that the North American stations didn't have, and they had a lot of collaborating Arab voices, basically, to make it seem more substantial, basically. So they remain important today, because on almost everything except Gaza they have been running a toxic line.
Well, it seems like Palestine, because it is what the empire allows Al Jazeera to be critical on in order to capture the audience, and therefore when you watch the rest of their content and news positionality, Al Jazeera, it's all pro-imperialist position on every other file except Palestine. It's critical, and that's, I think, the strategy of making sure you can hoard the audience into one place, because it doesn't matter what position you take on Palestine publicly. What matters is your actions, and the actions of Qatar is to open their, to have the biggest air base in the world for the United States.
Biggest military base in the region. Well, if you discount Israel itself, but really Palestine in the West, of course, it's a very popular issue. And many non-resistance people support it in their own way of what support means, basically. And I think we have to recognise that that's been a real achievement of the resistance, the Palestinian resistance, historically over decades, that they have imposed on dominant Western cultures Palestine as a legitimate liberation issue. But of course, as you say, there are severe limits in terms of any action related to that. In particular, I would say the boundary is moving into resistance. Even you can be Israeli and say you support Palestinians, but once you're Israeli and you support the resistance, you are out of your family, you're out of your job, you're out of everything. That historian Ilan Pappé is a good example of that. He was one of those honest historians who started to write, that famous book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. You can do that as a historian, even as an Israeli. But once you start to say, well, the resistance is legitimate, actually, then everyone rejects you, and he was effectively exiled to Britain.
And he's teaching in Essex University right now. To go back to Syria, you arrived there, you saw the beginnings of the war on Syria, the Western war on Syria. You were in the front lines of this war, reporting and writing your books. Right now Syria has fallen to the Wahhabi death squads. It's gone. The resistance is gone. The Syrian military and all of its infrastructure built over 60 years, totally destroyed. Now Syria airspace is being used to fuel Israeli air jets, the British, the French, the Americans, and to bombard from there Iran. A huge 180 degrees difference from that day till today. Just briefly, I know I don't want to get us too deep into this because we need to talk about the latest developments in the news. But what would you say, let us to this moment of fall of Syria? 15 years of war, is that enough to bring down a society and a state? Or what's the biggest mistakes that the axis of resistance should look back at from that battle?
Well, one thing is the lessons. The first is to understand what happened in Syria, and unfortunately some of the detail of that is hidden from us by events, basically. But you're right, it's a huge tragedy. Syria played a very important role. Whatever, of course, all the pretexts for the hybrid war on Syria were framed in terms of, the democratic system or human rights, whatever. That was nothing to do with it, of course. It was entirely a matter of hegemonic interests that they wanted to destroy an important link in the regional resistance. And from the point of view of the Syrian people, the Syrian Arab Army was the most popular institution in the country by far. I know Assad, there are criticisms of Assad, but that was not really the point. Assad was the best option during all of that time of the dirty war. And we can see now what the alternative they were fighting was, and it's such a terrible tragedy that so many tens of thousands of people, including Syrian soldiers, gave their lives to try and avert what happened 2 years ago, a year and a half ago in Syria. So the collapse then, I think there are many critiques of what was going on there. I think the collapse was really, of course, orchestrated by the occupying powers, the Israelis, the US, and Erdogan in Turkey. But also there were internal weaknesses, basically, that some of the senior people in the army command were purchased, obviously. There were traitors and there were loyal people. It wasn't on sectarian grounds. During the whole war, there were great attempts by the enemy to destroy the army on sectarian grounds. That didn't work. It was a genuine national institution. The Syrian soldiers on pitiful wages were prepared to fight and did fight, but there was a corruption of the senior command structure by the enemy, by Qatar and Erdogan, basically. We know that Qatar played this role. Qatar was the major funder of HTS, the group that took over Damascus in December 2024, was it? And so they are the ones, of course, that run Al Jazeera that we were just talking about. So
all of these, visits to Syria and the books that you were publishing and the lectures you were giving got you in trouble. And we saw, of course, the Zionists attempt to chase you out of the University of Sydney, which you taught there for 2 decades. It's a lifetime. And so tell us about that battle at the university. And I think the audience will be interested in hearing this story, because we hear similar efforts to ostracize and take out and fire and harass any professors in universities in Canada, the US, the UK, other places that are critical of the imperial positions of their governments.
Well, look, people talk about the Zionist lobby, it's true, there's a powerful Zionist lobby, but nevertheless, we have to remember that the objectives of the Zionist lobby are embedded in the US state and the collaborator states like Australia and Canada, for example. So when universities or media attack us for being anti-Zionist or pro-resistance, we have to remember that this is something that's deeply embedded in the system. I think the Zionist lobby plays a role in focusing attention and occasionally pointing in the direction of certain people to cancel, but the Zionist counterculture has managed, in their efforts to try and maintain Israeli soft power, which collapsed entirely with the war on Gaza. I mean, they lost their soft power. They built it up over many decades. They certainly got removed from their positions. At least 200 academics and teachers in the US, in Britain, in Australia, in Canada. There are many people in the situation I was in. Basically, first of all, they wanted to remove any platform we had to speak, take our positions away from us and so on. They were very successful in that, basically. And they still, in my country, still run test cases against those who have simply a voice on social media. There's some well-known independent journalists, for example, who are harassed by these legal mechanisms because the Zionists have a lot of professional help. They have a very large network, and not all of them necessarily pro-Netanyahu. They may be liberal Zionists, but they are in the habit of running these sorts of test cases. So with me, they were successful in the end so far, because they kicked me out of my job that I had for 20 years.
You had one originally in court.
We had 5 years of court cases. The Academics Union was running the case. The management of the University of Sydney, first of all, said there was no such thing as a right to intellectual freedom. You had to follow orders, basically. And the first court judgment basically agreed with that. Then we appealed. A full bench said, no, there is actually something written, in black and white, that's a right to intellectual freedom, and there are certain limits to it if you don't harass and vilify people and so on. And so on that basis, I won. And then on the third or the fourth stage, they ordered my reinstatement, several years back pay and so on. And then a final appeal made by the management, they managed to cancel all of that out with 2 judges out of 3, one of whom was a rabid Zionist, by saying, no, well, apart from intellectual freedom, you have to prove to the management that you're acting in the highest possible standards of the academy. Didn't matter that you hadn't breached any standard, you had to prove a case to the people who were trying to shut you up that you're acting in the highest standards. What did the highest standards mean? Well, I had to prove it, and I hadn't proven it, and there was no standard for it. So it's an extraordinary...
So they just keep on moving the goalposts.
Actually, it was a university management themselves that created that type of fictitious idea. But they managed to get 2 of the 3 judges, one of whom was we didn't know, he was a closet Zionist, to agree to that proposition, So this is the problem. You don't really know who the judges are going to be in a corrupted system like that.
Oh yeah, it's a colonial court, and you're at the whim of that judge. You're not really being judged on written laws. It's the whim of that judge, and most people should understand that cases like this sometimes take 10, 15, 20 years in court. And it's a lot of money and a lot of resources and a lot of time, effort. So I personally have taken many court cases in Canada, twice to the Supreme Court. One case that I'm still on this file has been going on since 2013. So right now we're on year 12, and it went twice to the Supreme Court, and most probably it's going to go. And this case wasn't even that political.
They want to exhaust you. They want to exhaust you.
This case is about community television licensing and funding. So you could imagine if it was about Palestine.
Well, they don't want you to have a voice. They don't want any voice like yours to be out there.
Of course. So you were the first, I think, international activist to be invited to Yemen during the attacks on Yemen, during the siege on Yemen. Tell us about that experience, because I personally am very jealous.
I was doing some work with Yemeni colleagues for a while, doing some translations into Spanish. I'm still doing it with them, but I was asking for several years, perhaps 4 or 5 years, how can I get to Yemen? And it was very, very difficult until earlier this year. And they said, well, the flights, there are flights that foreigners can come in on. The flight started at one stage, and it was only for Yemenis. And then I was able to get in February this year, basically. And that's right, I was the first foreign academic to be there in 15 years, I think. So I was mobbed, frankly. Really, it was just the most tremendous, deeply Arab reception. The hospitality was extraordinary, and this is, I think, what a lot of people are curious about. Yemen, how is it that a little country that was called the worst humanitarian crisis on earth before the Gaza genocide, and they defeated a coalition backed by the US with the Saudis and Emiratis that have obviously buckets of money. They defeated them, and then they were the only state in the region to rise immediately to the defense of their brothers and sisters in Palestine. And I think that it's made a lot of people curious. So a lot of my friends said, how can I get there? So I've been trying to put them in touch with the people who organise it, because the Yemenis are very keen to have foreign visitors. But at the moment, even when I arrived there in February, they'd already bombed Hotait port, they'd bombed the airport, they'd destroyed...
And the they is the United States and all its vessels in the region, including the
Israelis at that stage. And then, of course, they confronted the US and British warships. And then for a brief time, until they were defeated, the US Navy was bombing them too. But they've really retreated under the pretext that Yemen somehow capitulated, or they call them Houthi rebels. Houthi rebels, really, it's a coalition government. I'm writing about this at the moment. You know, I'm doing a joint book with some Yemeni colleagues. It's a coalition government led by Ansarullah, but they have major sections of the opposition parties. They have former Muslim Brotherhood people. It is really the most inclusive system you will have seen. The Ansarullah movement has done it, which led the revolution of 2014, 2015. Basically drew in a very wide group of people, and they did everything they could to avoid fighting their fellow Yemenis, basically, even though there were mercenaries from Yemen itself as well as from surrounding areas used against them. So to arrive in Yemen at that time, when they were still engaged in those activities in support of the al-Aqsa flood operation in Palestine, was really an extraordinary experience, and it made me read a bit deeper into the roots of their ideology and to see the popular support. Of course, the popular support within Yemen has increased a lot since the Red Sea operations in support of Gaza, because Palestine is incredibly popular in Yemen itself. And a number of the enemies, for example, on the Muslim Brotherhood side and in the south of Yemen, were very upset to see that they ended up on the opposite side to which they expected to be, you know, in support of Israel as opposed to in support of Palestine. So there have been ongoing defections, which some Western analysts have recognised, to Ansarullah. So it's really swelled their support, basically. So I got a chance to travel around the country a little bit and then to start to try and help arrange visits by other people, which there's been a few. Some Latin American colleagues went in, and some very prominent activists like Mandela Mandela and Jackson Hinkle and Pepe Escobar managed to visit too. They had a Palestine conference in March. So I think Yemen is opening up to the world, and I would like to use my networks to open the world up to them. I've talked to my Latin American colleagues, to colleagues in China about Yemen, and because so far only one state in the world recognises the revolutionary government in Sana'a, and that's the Islamic Republic of Iran. For a brief time, the Assad government in Syria recognised Yemen, but unfortunately, to try and please their Arab League colleagues in the Gulf, President Assad withdrew from that and pushed the Ansarullah ambassador out of Damascus and tried to distance himself a little bit from the resistance. And I think that's one of the criticisms that can be justly made about President Assad, even though he represented the best possibility for the Syrian people for many years. But he was really trying a bit too hard to please the Saudis and the others in the GCC in the hope of getting some investment in Syria, which never materialised. And they maintained that project to destroy him and install these moderate head choppers, as we see now, in Damascus, which have brought a great tragedy to Syria, not just to the resistance, but also to the Syrian people.
Well, just a few pointers about Yemen. The vast majority of people in Yemen live under the rule of the Sana'a government. Almost 90% of the population lives in that zone. The vast majority of the Yemenis are Yazidis, which the Sunnis call Shia and the Shia call Sunni, so they're kind of the middle ground between both. And they are the origin of all the Arabic people, including the ancestors of the Arabs, the Phoenicians and the Philistines. They all came from Yemen as seafarers. And Yemen was the first seafaring civilization in the region here, before even the Phoenicians. This is part of why Yemen is so connected to Palestine. This is, beyond just support of resistance. These connections make it impossible that an Arab identity can exist without Yemen, and certainly not a Palestinian identity cannot exist without Yemen. It's been now 3 days that the Israelis decided to attack Iran. Many analysts thought that this was not going to happen after the war in Lebanon and the genocide in Gaza. A lot of people felt surprised that the Israelis attacked Iran. Were you surprised that this happened?
I think I was, although, as we know, and all of the better commentators, including North American commentators, were saying Netanyahu has been trying for this for 30 years, more than 30 years, really. All of the thing about Iran being on the point of a nuclear weapon, which was just a pretext. They didn't like the influence that Iran had in the region and support for the independent peoples of the region, in particular the Palestinians. So North American conservative commentators were saying, look, Netanyahu is trying to drag Trump into a war. We don't want to get involved in it. So far, we all know that the US is behind the attacks on Iran, but it's a semi-covert operation on the part of the US so far. They're trying to pretend this was all Netanyahu so far, which may give them an out. It might give them an out, or it might lead to escalation. We don't really know yet. So I think it did catch me by surprise, because we tend to think that perhaps the US might have had some restraining hand on Netanyahu. The relation is one that people have very different theories about, the relationship between the Zionists and Washington, basically. But in any case, it happened, and clearly Netanyahu had always wanted to drag the US into a war with Iran.
There's three theories there about the relationship, and I would like to know which one you study. There's the theory that Zionists rule the West, and all the politicians are bought off in the West, and actually the control is in Tel Aviv, not in Washington. There's the theory that it's all capitalism and imperialism, and that the Zionists are just tools of imperialism, and it's the master is in the White House. And then there's the third theory that there's a full, complete symbiosis between Zionism, imperialism, and capitalism, and that in fact, currently the empire cannot exist without the existence of the Zionist colony, and the whole propaganda mechanism of the empire would collapse if the Zionists are purged out of it.
Okay, well, if that's the case, I'm in a fourth camp. And
a fourth camp. Let's hear this, please.
And the fourth camp is that the Israeli colony is effectively an extension of the US state. Now, it's true it has some sort of limited autonomy in that situation, but I've always been of the belief, and it's a belief that the Yemeni, the Ansarallah leaders say, and Hassan Nasrallah said, that the Zionist tail does not wag the imperial dog. The Zionist tail is the tail of the dog. And of course, as the main foreign outpost in this region, it has substantial support, of course, within the US state itself, with those who want an expansionist US regime. I don't believe in any sort of generalized theories that this is to do with the accumulation process in capitalism, really, because the imperial reality today is something that wasn't created with capitalism, basically. It's a hegemonic project, which, of course, in terms of the Israeli colony, was begun by the British, basically, and inherited probably in the 50s by the US regime, basically. But nevertheless, it's effectively a possession of the US regime with some significant relative autonomy, basically. So, of course, that means that the Israeli regime is also embedded in Washington itself. And but I think the payment system, you know, people stress how many hundreds of thousands each congressperson and so on has from the lobby group. That is simply a reinforcing factor, just as the Zionist lobby was a reinforcing factor in purging me from the university, because the Australian state didn't want me there either, basically, and that's their policy. To this day, although they're trying to break from the Australian state, like the Canadian state and the British, are trying to distance themselves from the US with this new revised position where they're starting to criticise the operations in Gaza after 20 months. After 20 months, they're saying this is unacceptable, but they're trying to stake out a different position to that of Washington, because Washington has been so extreme in its support for the genocide, indeed deeply embedded in the operations within Gaza itself. You know, to my mind, the Gaza operations are effectively led by what's called CENTCOM, the US military, which pretends to control this part of the world, you know, West Asia, just like they've got AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM to control the rest of the world. They've got the whole world pegged out. They think they run the world, basically. And then they talk about brutal dictators in these little countries dotted around the world who are resisting them for the most part, basically.
So that you know, let's carry your theory there into what's happening right now with this war. It doesn't matter whether it was Netanyahu that dragged the whole West into it, and or is it Washington using Israel as a proxy and hiding behind it. The fact is, right now, American, French, Italian, German, and British refueling and surveillance planes are flying in the airspace of Syria, Iraq, and the Gulf, aiding the Israelis in their attack. Most probably also American fighter jets and NATO fighter jets are actually part of the bombardment pretending to be Israeli. And we just heard from Prime Minister Starmer of the UK last night saying that he's moving most of their air force into the region to provide support for Israel in this war. So the war is being conducted on Iran in full symbiosis, again, between all the components of the empire.
Well, we know that, I mean, it's well known now, there have been reports on the supply of the Israelis from Cyprus, I think. And also the previous Iran attacks, what was it, True Promise 2, that they were scoping more or less who was running and what sort of air defence was running. Back at that time, we know this same constellation of states you mentioned were involved in defending the Israeli regime at that time. So yes, as you say, they're embedded in this current operation too, but with a veneer, a semblance of arm's length, more or less. You know, the US, Trump, depending on which day it is, and Marco Rubio saying, we are not directly involved in this. It's a lie, of course, but they're trying to position themselves so they have room to move to, they're not, I don't believe that they are completely committed to, certainly not to Netanyahu. Their commitment to an Israeli regime, one form or other of an Israeli regime, and I've been in the belief for some time, and I've written about it for some years, that I believe there may well be a collapse in the Israeli regime, but it won't lead to a liberated Palestine straight away. There's going to be some in-between struggle where important forces in the Western sponsors, including liberal Zionists, who dominate Zionists outside the Israeli regime, or the fascist faction dominates within Israel, we know that they are really of a mentality in concert with Netanyahu. But many of the liberal Zionists themselves don't like Netanyahu, would be happy if he was gone or even dead, basically. And they will think about the next phase. The next phase would be, and I believe this from when we look at the dismantling of racial regimes in the past, in Africa, in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, they will try and hold on to the privileges of the colonists, in particular the control of land, but also there's the question of the refugees. You know, I think the UN Rapporteur Francesca Albanese makes this point. Even if they abolish apartheid tomorrow in all of historic Palestine, there are some Zionists who support that. And there's even a group, a large NGO in the US which supports that idea, but they want to hold on to some allegedly historical, cultural commitments or links that the Zionists have to historic Palestine, not just to 48 Palestine. So I think that there is a positioning going on of the Western regime, so they may be able to tolerate the collapse of Netanyahu and the death of Netanyahu and the other collaborators. They've imposed sanctions, haven't they, on some of his extremist collaborators, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, for example. The government of my country has done that. What for? After 20 months of slaughter, which the whole government's been involved in, they've imposed sanctions on a couple of extremists, but not on Netanyahu himself, who is an indicted war criminal.
Yeah, none of those decisions by Smotrich or Ben-Gvir as ministers would have come to reality if the actual government didn't vote to support them. So the whole government of Netanyahu cabinet is complicit in whatever crimes the UK blames Ben-Gvir on. One thing here is that since the morning, the Zionists have threatened to destroy Iranian nuclear sites. They have called on Iran to withdraw anyone in the sites, which tells us that most probably if they are attacked, Iran will also hit nuclear sites like Dimona inside the Zionist colony. Netanyahu called on Trump last night to have the United States get involved directly in supporting Israel, which in a way is a declaration of defeat. He needs now, the US and the West is fighting this war already on his behalf, but now he needs them to publicly say they're going to fight on their behalf, and that's a declaration of defeat of the Zionist colony. What do you expect in the next 24 hours with these announcements?
I think it's an interesting point that the Netanyahu is really trying to impose himself on the body politic of his owners, effectively. And he expects that. He's always expected that. But let's remember there's some historical cases like this. What was it with the Israelis back in one of the previous wars? Was it in the 60s? That they were trying to incite the US to get involved, or the British and the French tried to incite the US to get involved
1956
in the Suez crisis.
Yes, Suez crisis.
And the US did not at that, Eisenhower did not at that time. Also, if you remember Georgia, when Georgia took on the Russians at one stage over some little breakaway sections, and the Georgian president at the time thought he could drag Bush into a war there, and Bush said no. So it's a moment for Trump in a way to say, after all, their public position is we are not directly involved, even though you and I know it's a lie, but nevertheless, he is able to carry through with that lie and say, well, no, this is something that we didn't agree to, and Netanyahu did it, and we support Israel. But so there's a way out for the rats in Washington, even though they're being paid by the Israeli lobby, because I don't think they want a war with Iran. They haven't wanted a war with Iran. It was always Netanyahu, and of course, let's remember in terms of the catalyzing of this Israeli attack on Iran, which Russia condemns, China condemns, but the NATO states are all saying it's Israel defending itself still. But let's remember the catalyst was Netanyahu was in court. He was crying sick to prevent the court proceedings going on. There was a motion in their parliament, the apartheid parliament, to dissolve the parliament and therefore undermine the government there.
Yes, that was the whole fight with the Haredim,
the conscription of conservative Jews into the military there. So that timing of that may have been important in Netanyahu's decision. But nevertheless, it leaves the potential of an independent response by the US there. And they've been taken for granted. And they don't like being taken for granted. And probably Trump doesn't like it. He doesn't really like Netanyahu because they're two dysfunctional alpha males who are pretending they rule the world, So I don't think it's a given thing that Trump is going to weigh in the way that Netanyahu wants him to weigh in. And of course, failing that, Netanyahu's military is in great danger of being annihilated effectively. And I think the Iranians had used this so-called strategic caution for a long time, which I know frustrated a lot of people that they had not intervened earlier. But they'd used that because they'd calculated that if there were a large-scale confrontation with the Israelis and leading to the Israeli regime at great risk of completely collapsing, then the US would intervene. That was an assumption. And so Iran prepared itself for a war with the US all this time with its huge stockpiles of missiles and so on, and with an eye to all of the US bases in the Persian Gulf. But so far, Iran has not attacked those bases in the Persian Gulf, and I think they would prefer not to.
There was attacks yesterday, at least the Americans claimed, of drones on 2 American bases in Iraq. That was happening at the same time Netanyahu was officially requesting American direct involvement in the war. And this morning, by the way, the American government said, not yet, no thanks.
Yeah.
So they're going to continue to aid Israel behind the line, maybe even fly their planes with a painted new flag on them and bombard Iran, but they're not going to do it directly. What about China and Russia? We saw, look, this is a war that could lead us to a nuclear holocaust, a nuclear fallout on the whole region. Even if these nuclear sites are attacked without using nuclear weapons, whether in Iran or the Zionist colony, there's going to be nuclear fallout on the whole world. We saw the Security Council battle as usual. There was no resolution because of vetoes and so on. And up until now, we haven't seen any direct involvement of the Russians and the Chinese, as the whole West is involved behind Israel. We can note that yesterday tracking sites, flight tracking sites, showed a Chinese military cargo plane landing in Iran. No one can tell us what was on this plane. Do you think this is the beginnings of Chinese military support through proxy to Iran? Can we expect Russia to do something like this also?
We know that there are strategic agreements now between Iran and Russia and China, but at the same time, neither Russia nor China have, and they've engaged in joint military operations, naval operations too, but so far there's been no direct engagement by either. We do know that Russia has agreed to and has announced in recent days to build 8 new nuclear power plants in Iran. Now, this is a very interesting statement in the face of what was supposed to be nuclear talks with the US. We know really that the so-called nuclear talks were nothing to do with Iran's nuclear industry. It was all to do with trying to cripple the role of Iran in the region. And we've seen now how effective Iran's defense capabilities without nuclear weapons are. So in terms of the nuclear threat, you can't discount the fact that Netanyahu is a genuine madman, and there is some real implicit threat there for some time. But in terms of confrontation between China and Russia and the US, I mean, it takes some sort of mutual engagement to bring that up. I don't see that.
Let's take it a step behind, a little bit. I'm not expecting right now direct involvement of China and Russia, and I mean the US is not directly involved until now, claims. But can we, Russia, for instance, was paid for S-400s by Iran. Russia was paid by Iran for Sukhoi bombers and fighters. None of that was delivered before this attack. Will Russia deliver some of those weapons that Iran paid for? Will China, if Russia doesn't? I mean, China just gave their J-20 somewhat or 30 somewhat, whatever, I don't remember the number of it, their fighters jets that were crucial to Pakistan's battle with India. Could China deliver something like this in order for Iran to defend its own airspace at least? Can we expect those two powers to actually be as serious as how the West is backing its own vessels?
I mean, first of all, let's remember this type of technology is typically not given. It's sold, basically. I don't know exactly what the details of the S-400 with Iran were, but I know that Iran has developed its own substantial air defense. We've seen they've shot down a number of Israeli fighter planes now. Whether they were 35s or 18s, I'm not sure. But Iran has this relationship with China. Russia has, Russia has also used Iranian technology. But they deny that Iran is exporting it. Now I think it's quite possible that the Iranians provided the technology for the Shahed drones to the Russians, which have been very effective in Ukraine, and the Russians have mass-produced them. Now, it may be that the Russians have shared some technology with the Iranians, and the Iranians are now producing their own air defense, because it seems like they have a substantial air defense. It is working at the moment as we speak. A similar thing happened with Yemen, of course. People have been claiming that the Yemenis have been using Iranian weapons, but the more honest ones say, no, that's not the case. They are actually produced in Yemen. I've seen them showing me at least the models of them in Yemen and telling me that they're made in Yemen. In fact, one shopkeeper was asking me, I was looking at some clothes there, and most of them were made in China. And I said, no, I don't want a made in China clothes. I wanted to get a jacket made in Yemen. And he said, listen, everything made in Yemen is rubbish, except the missiles, except the missiles. Everyone knows that these Palestine 2 missiles at Mach 16, this is why they're getting through, and they shot them at occupied Jaffa recently in coordination with the Iranians, which I think is extraordinarily important, that the Yemenis are now coordinating directly with the Iranian military in their attacks on the Zionists. But we know that effectively the Yemenis have reverse engineered that technology. I believe the Iranians have also reverse engineered a lot of technology, and they're sharing technology with Russia and possibly with China as well.
I mean, this war, according to Netanyahu, is going to last at least 2 weeks. That's what he said on the first day. Now we hear Zionist analysts and leaders say it's going to be 2 months. I don't know what's going to be left of the Zionist colony even in 2 weeks if this bombardment continues at this rate by the Iranian government. But the axis of resistance received a lot of blows before the war started. One, what we saw in Lebanon here with the assassination of the leadership of Hezbollah and the fall of Syria completely to the American hegemon, and the attacks on Yemen that Yemen withstood, or the mass destruction of Gaza. So how can we assess right now the axis of resistance as a whole? You mentioned the Yemenis getting involved in this war. Could we see Hezbollah returning to this war? Could we see, as this war expands, something happening in Syria? What is your assessment?
Yeah, I think in terms of the entire region, and it's been a regional war for many, many years now. When they talk about expanding to a regional war, it's been regional for quite some time. That means also that the cooperation, the coordination of the components of the resistance is very important. Now, the Yemenis said to me in February that they consider they have a much greater responsibility for the regional resistance after the collapse of Damascus, basically. The resistance in Syria, I believe, is very fragmented, very small. There's too many divisions at the moment for it to be substantial. I think it will regrow in time. You're right that the resistance in Lebanon is weakened. It hasn't disappeared. Effectively, it prevented the takeover of South Lebanon, with a lot of collaboration from Palestinians too. I think people should recognize that just as many Lebanese resistance fighters gave their lives for Gaza, so many Palestinians gave their lives in South Lebanon to prevent a takeover of South Lebanon. So that type of coordination is extremely important, and they did prevent the takeover of a number of villages down there, even though the Zionists have not left the south of Lebanon yet. Yemen is playing a more important role. The Netanyahu has made what's probably his fatal mistake by attacking Iran without under the pressure that he was under of his own internal contradictions, without having a real assurance from the US that they are going to weigh into it as much as he would like. They're weighing into it, but to what extent are they going to weigh into it? We don't know yet, basically. So there are these, and the Iraqi resistance is very powerful morally, but constrained by the occupation that Iraq still suffers. Really, the Iraqi government is still crippled by this, even though it's a relatively small occupation, but it prevents the Iraqi government from doing many things. So they are involved to some extent and have been involved for many months in attacking the Zionist entity. So I think we've got to look at those links and that level of coordination. What gives me some hope is the fact that the Iranian response has been very strong so far, no sign of letting up. And I think one thing that Netanyahu did was to destroy any residual reluctance that the big liberal factions in Iran had about responding, basically. There was always this thought amongst a very large Iranian middle class that they would like to have a deal with the US, get back into the international trade and commerce, have economic opportunities, and the cooler heads there, what they call the hardliners or the principalists, said, no, they are not going to, they're not going to accept an independent Iran in these circumstances. So I think Netanyahu unified the factions within Iran to give a greater sense of unity, a greater solidity, a greater popular support to the hard revenge that was promised for so long but not delivered from the Iranian side. That is now being supported by the Yemenis, perhaps to some limited extent by the resistance in Iraq too, and that the rise of those elements is going to consolidate their positions within their own countries and hopefully deliver some benefits to the weakened parts of the resistance in Lebanon in particular.
We saw a lot of videos on that point yesterday and the night before in Iran, thousands upon thousands of people out in the streets all night long. cheering on their army, including many women without hijab. Those
calling
liberals,
for nuclear weapons.
yes, calling for nuclear weapons.
They're angry. They're very angry.
Of course, I mean, this is where I think the West, the imperialists, their racism blinds them sometimes from seeing facts like this, that societies like Iran and the Arabic peoples have very much love for their nations and their populations.
And on the other side, in Israel, the Israeli media is still pretending that they are somehow winning. One of the papers, I think Marouf, published this picture of the Beirut port explosion and said this was the result of them bombing some site in Shiraz in Iran. So they're trying to keep their own population ignorant. The arrogance is blinding them too.
And this attack on the military-industrial complex zone in the Haifa port and north of the Haifa port reminded me last night, of course, of the Hotait video, the first one that Hezbollah sent for the surveillance drone that flew over this area and identified every factory, identified every secret building of, as well as the residences of the Israeli Navy in the area, residences of their families. And
well, they hit Netanyahu's house with a drone, I think, also.
Yeah, and last night, the Kedumim, the colony in the West Bank where Smotrich lives, was also hit. It's the first time 2 colonies in the West Bank were hit. These, I think, as the war moves on, there will be more and more of these hits on colonies in the West Bank that are easy targets. If the Zionists continue to target civilians in Iran, we should be seeing more. This war, in your opinion?
The Gaza resistance is still active. They are still shooting, invading Israeli soldiers in Gaza too. They haven't been destroyed completely. People say Gaza was completely destroyed. No, the people are still there, the will is still there, and an armed resistance is still in Gaza.
Yeah, last night there was 7 high security incidents, as the Zionists call them. We got to see only 2 of them on television. But one of those 7 was inside the Gaza Strip, the Gaza extermination camp, where the resistance ambushed a platoon of Israeli soldiers. The resistance is still going on. Thank you very much, Tim Anderson, for being with us. We wish you the best of luck. Welcome to Lebanon. We hope to see you again and again in this region. This was Laith Marouf from Free Palestine TV. I remind you one more time to press the subscribe button on whatever social media platform you're watching this on, and to go to our website, freepalestine.video, to donate so we can continue producing this content. We hope everybody's safety in the region, and we wish for the liberation of Palestine. Until we see you next time, we bid you all a free Palestine.